December 25, 1944. Somewhere in the western Pacific, the jungle is silent. Only the wind moves, carrying the smell of rot, salt, and cordite through the shattered palms. The battle has been over for days, but the island still feels haunted. Rusted helmets, broken rifles, and the whisper of waves against coral mark what used to be hell. A group of U.S. Marines stand near a burned-out truck. Their uniforms are torn, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. In the shade of a collapsed bunker, a handful of Japanese soldiers sit, thin, trembling, their eyes dull from hunger. Prisoners, once enemies who had vowed to die before surrender. A Marine private, barely 20, opens a ration tin. The metallic click echoes in the still air. He hesitates, then steps forward, slow, cautious, and places the can in front of one of the prisoners. No words, just the faint rhythm of the ocean, and the quiet sound of men who haven't spoken in weeks breathing the same air. For a moment, the war pauses. And on that Christmas day, enemies share something neither side expected: mercy. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific War had become a furnace that consumed everything: men, machines, and sanity alike. The grand Japanese advance of 1941-42 was long over. The empire that had once stretched from Manchuria to the Solomons was shrinking island by island, under the relentless weight of American firepower. The U.S. Navy ruled the seas. The skies were filled with B-29s, and below them, on the scorched islands of the Pacific, the U.S. Marines were fighting one of the most brutal campaigns in military history. Every island was a fortress, every hill a trap, every soldier a believer in death before surrender. Japan's high command had issued an unbending doctrine, Gyokusai, the concept of honorable annihilation. To die for the emperor was the ultimate act of service. To be captured, the ultimate shame. This wasn't merely an order. It was a creed drilled into every man who landed on Pacific shores with the rising sun on his sleeve. For the Americans, it was a nightmare. On Tarawa, Marines had learned that bombardment meant nothing when the enemy refused to die. On Saipan, they had watched entire families leap from cliffs rather than be taken prisoner. And now, as 1944 drew to a close, they were fighting on islands like Peleliu, Leyte, and Guam, each one costing thousands of lives for just a few square miles of coral and jungle. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but in the Pacific, it felt eternal. The weather never changed, the mud never dried, and the enemy never surrendered. In these final months, Japan's supply lines were collapsing. American submarines choked off fuel and food convoys, isolated garrisons, and sometimes tens of thousands of men were left to starve, cut off, forgotten, and still expected to fight. By late 1944, most Japanese soldiers on outlying islands were surviving on insects, coconuts, and rainwater. Some resorted to eating tree bark, others to far worse. The Americans knew this. They intercepted messages, read diaries, and found emaciated bodies when they advanced. But pity had no place here. The war had been too cruel, too personal. Yet among the Marines, something had begun to change. Many of the new recruits arriving in late 1944 were veterans of multiple island battles. They had seen men burn in their bunkers, had watched bayonet charges crumble under machine gun fire. The hatred was still there, but layered beneath it fatigue, a deep weariness that dulled the sharpness of vengeance. As Christmas approached, that exhaustion weighed heavy. The war's end was visible on the horizon, but not yet real. The talk of invasion, first Luzon, then Okinawa, then Japan itself, loomed ahead like a dark wave. On certain islands, the fighting had ended weeks before. The Marines stayed to secure supply dumps and round up stragglers, small groups of Japanese soldiers who either couldn't or wouldn't believe the war around them was lost. And on one such island, on one December morning, these two worlds, among the conquerors and the conquered, would briefly step outside of history's endless killing ground. A handful of Marines, with more rations than they needed, looked across at prisoners who had none. And on Christmas Day 1944, they made a choice that no manual or command order could explain, a gesture that would echo across generations, carried in faded photographs and quiet veterans' memories. The Pacific Campaign's final year had set the stage for that moment. To understand it fully, we must step closer into the specific battle that preceded it, the ground where this rare act of mercy was born. The island was small and little more than a patch of rock and coral hidden in the vast blue of the Philippine. Its name barely made headlines compared to Saipan or Iwo Jima, but for the men who fought there, it was everything. By December 1944, the Battle of Guam had ended months earlier, and the push through the Philippines was in full swing. Across the Pacific, American forces had reclaimed strategic ground at staggering cost. The Japanese garrisons left behind were no longer armies. They were ghosts, On Leyte, remnants of the Imperial Japanese Army clung to the mountains, living off roots and the corpses of fallen comrades. On smaller islands such as Peleliu or Angkor, hundreds of soldiers hid in caves, refusing to accept defeat even after the flag above them had changed. They had been trained to believe capture was a fate worse than death. And so, long after official reports declared these battles over, the jungle still whispered with the sounds of unseen men, the war's unfinished echoes. Among those assigned to these islands were U.S. Marines from the 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. They were tough, sunburned, and hollow-eyed. They had seen every kind of death imaginable. Many had stopped keeping count of days. By mid-December, they were tasked not with fighting, but with searching. Their orders: locate isolated enemy groups, secure tunnels, destroy hidden weapons caches, and, when possible, take prisoners. That, when possible, was rarely easy. Most Japanese soldiers would fight until killed, or take their own lives before surrendering. Those few who emerged with their hands raised often did so out of starvation, not faith in survival. The Marines treated prisoners with suspicion. They had seen too many feigned surrenders, grenades hidden beneath rags, sudden lunges with bayonets. Every encounter carried tension, but time and hunger had changed the balance. By late 1944, the jungle itself had become a more dangerous enemy than the opposing army. The Japanese survivors, many reduced to skeletons, began crawling from their caves. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were men stripped of everything: uniform, command, even ideology. Reports from Marine field journals tell of strange encounters. Small groups of Japanese soldiers emerging from the underbrush, hands trembling, begging for food in broken English. Marines hesitating, guns ready, unsure if it was another trap. But when the captives collapsed, unable to even stand, the decision became clear. They were starving, one Marine sergeant later recalled. You could see their bones under the skin. It wasn't a war anymore, it was survival. That December, word spread through the camp it would be Christmas soon. There were no trees, no songs, no snow, just the humid air of the Pacific, the smell of oil and sweat, and the low hum of generators. The men received their holiday rations: canned turkey, fruitcake, cigarettes, a taste of home half a world away. Nearby, a group of captured Japanese soldiers sat in silence behind a barbed wire fence. They were emaciated, covered in sores, too weak to move. They didn't know it was Christmas. To them, every day was just another struggle to stay alive. A few Marines, perhaps out of instinct more than intent, began to talk. Some felt guilty eating while prisoners starved. Others remembered the families they hadn't seen in years, the wives, the children, the warm kitchens waiting in a country at peace. And then came a simple act. One Marine, name lost to time, carried over a can of rations. He placed it down. Another followed. Then another. No one gave orders. No one stopped them. In that humid air beneath the tattered remnants of war, a quiet exchange began. The same hands that had thrown grenades months before now offered food. The same eyes that had once seen only an enemy now saw a man. And so, on an unnamed patch of Pacific soil on Christmas Day 1944, one of the rarest moments of the entire war unfolded. A fragile pause in the tide of hate. The Marines didn't speak Japanese. The prisoners didn't understand English, but none of it mattered. Food became the only language left between them. The world at large never heard of it then. There were no photographers, no reporters, no medals awarded. But for the men who witnessed it, that morning stayed imprinted, a memory of something small, yet greater than the war itself. And to understand why that moment mattered, we must explore it from every possible angle. By December 1944, hunger had become the only truth left on those islands. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered that Christmas weren't warriors anymore. They were ghosts draped in rags, their bones sharp against sunburned skin. The jungle had stripped them of everything but the instinct to survive. The Marines, hardened by years of fighting, had seen what starvation did to a man. They had seen Japanese soldiers eat anything: snakes, insects, even the leather from their boots. Some Marines, upon finding the bodies of enemy soldiers, noticed they were smaller, thinner than before, victims not of bullets, but of time and isolation. When the rations were handed over that morning, the reaction was cautious, almost fearful. The Japanese prisoners stared at the cans as though they might explode. They had been told that Americans were beasts, that capture meant torture or execution. Yet here they were, being fed. One Marine corporal later wrote, "They looked at the food like it wasn't real, like they couldn't decide if it was mercy or another trick." But then one man opened a can, another took a bite. The sound of spoons scraping metal broke the silence, a sound as ordinary as it was extraordinary in that place. For a few minutes, the war seemed to evaporate. No hatred, no ideology. Just men, young, frightened, starving, eating together beneath a tropical sun that neither side had ever truly wanted to die under. To the Marines, it was something simple, sharing Christmas. To the Japanese prisoners, it was something unimaginable, being treated as human again. It was the kind of moment that doesn't make it into history books, but changes the men who lived it forever. Tactically, what happened that Christmas Day was only possible because of how far Japan's war machine had fallen. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army's communication web across the Pacific had disintegrated. Entire divisions were stranded without orders. American island hopping had bypassed dozens of garrisons, leaving them to wither. On Peleliu alone, more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped after U.S. forces moved on. They had no hope of evacuation. Tokyo's high command called them honor garrisons, a euphemism for sacrifice. In practice, these men were doomed. Their officers ordered them to survive as long as possible, but with no supplies. Survival meant something crueler: endless hunger, isolation, and psychological decay. When the Marines returned to these islands for mop-up operations, the enemy they faced was not an organized army. It was a scattering of desperate men. Some still fought, others dug in, refusing to surrender even as they starved. Those who did surrender were often too weak to resist. They were discovered in caves, bunkers, and makeshift camps, skeletal, feverish, delirious. Many didn't even understand that the war around them had moved on. The Christmas truce that unfolded wasn't born from diplomacy or mutual recognition. It was the byproduct of total collapse, of men reaching the edge of what the human body could endure. From a tactical standpoint, it also reflected a quiet shift in the American approach. By the end of 1944, Marine and Army units were under orders to take prisoners when possible. Intelligence officers needed information about fortifications, logistics, and morale. Feeding captives, even briefly, served a practical purpose: to keep them alive long enough to talk. But no one wrote an order that said, "Share your rations on Christmas." That came from somewhere else entirely. For the Marines, emotions were complicated. Most had lost friends, burned alive in bunkers, drowned in the surf, or shot during banzai charges. Hatred had been survival. It was easier to kill when you didn't think of the man on the other side as human. But after 2 years of fighting, something had shifted. The young Marines who had landed full of vengeance were now older, tired, and numb. When they saw the prisoners, fragile, defeated, half-dead, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like looking into a mirror that showed what war did to everyone. Christmas, even in war, carried a strange weight. It reminded men of the world beyond the battlefield, of families who still believed in peace, of warmth, of home. For many Marines, that morning was the first time in years they'd felt something close to mercy. There are reports of men who couldn't eat their rations after seeing the prisoners. One corporal broke a fruitcake into pieces and passed them through the wire. Another gave his cigarette ration to a captured officer who bowed silently before lighting it. In those gestures, emotion replaced training, and in that fragile moment, pity overcame hate. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first step toward it. For a few brief hours, that invisible line between enemies blurred. The Marines saw men, not monsters. The Japanese prisoners saw compassion, not propaganda. And though the sound of distant artillery still echoed over the horizon, on that small island, for that one Christmas morning, the war's fury paused. The next section looks deeper, into the psychological, cultural, and moral layers of that day. The parts of war that don't live in strategy or statistics but in memory. For the Japanese prisoners, that Christmas morning was not just a meal. It was a collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. From their earliest training, they were told that Americans were savages, men without honor, soldiers who mutilated prisoners and desecrated the dead. Propaganda leaflets and instructors had painted surrender as worse than death. To die shouting the emperor's name was purity. To live in the enemy's mercy was shame. That's why when they were captured, most couldn't comprehend what was happening. They expected torture. Instead, they were given food. The rations, ordinary to the Marines, became symbols of contradiction. In one Japanese diary recovered later, the prisoner wrote simply, "They fed us. I do not understand this war anymore." The act of sharing rations wasn't just physical relief. It cracked open a lifetime of conditioning. For men who had watched friends commit suicide rather than fall into American hands, that kindness rewrote reality. On the American side, there was a quieter form of psychological release. Marines who had spent years dehumanizing their opponents suddenly faced them up close, vulnerable and silent. It forced a question none wanted to ask. Had we become the thing we hated most? Feeding a prisoner didn't answer that, but it was a start. War breaks the mind before it breaks the body. That day, both sides glimpsed what it meant to reclaim a piece of their lost humanity. Culture shaped everything about that moment. For the Marines, Christmas wasn't just a date. It was memory. It was mothers, letters from home, carols sung in the cold. It was a symbol of warmth even in the tropics. For the Japanese soldiers, the holiday meant nothing. Their code was Bushidō, the way of the warrior. Honor, discipline, and death in service to the emperor. There was no mercy in Bushidō, no room for holidays or sentiment, and yet for a few brief hours, these two belief systems coexisted. The Americans, raised on the Christian idea of goodwill and redemption, extended a hand. The Japanese, trained in the stoic endurance of Bushidō, accepted, silently, rigidly, as though unsure how to respond. In that fragile meeting, two worlds that had been bred to destroy each other shared the simplest act imaginable. Eating together. It was not a truce. It was not forgiveness. It was a cultural paradox. One faith-driven, one duty-driven, meeting on neutral ground. Some Marines later said it didn't even feel religious at first. It was instinct. Humanity, stripped of flags and oaths. But when night came and the men lit cigarettes beneath the stars, a few whispered carols broke through the humid air. One Marine chaplain wrote in his log, "For the first time since Guadalcanal I saw peace. Not victory, just peace." For the Japanese captives, it was the first moment in years when no one demanded they die for honor. They simply existed, not soldiers, not enemies, just men sitting beneath the same sky. And in that way, perhaps Christmas, even without translation, did reach them. Morality in total war is a fragile thing. The Pacific Campaign had erased most of it. Civilians burned in firebombings. Prisoners were executed. Atrocities were committed on both sides. Every inch of land had been bought with blood and hate. So when Marines chose to feed their prisoners, it wasn't a strategic gesture. It was moral rebellion, a momentary rejection of the war's logic. Military command neither encouraged nor condemned it. There was no report filed, no reprimand issued. It was too small, too human for the paperwork of war. But those who were there remembered it vividly, because it made them question everything they had come to accept as necessary. One sergeant later reflected, "I'd killed more men than I could count, but giving a meal to one of them, that's the only thing I still think about." That statement, recorded decades later in an oral history interview, captures the heart of the moral paradox, that a simple act of kindness can haunt more deeply than violence. For the Japanese soldiers, that morality was alien. They had been taught to despise weakness, to equate compassion with surrender. But that day, when the enemy gave them food instead of death, the Bushidō code cracked. They realized that mercy was not weakness. It was strength. The kind their war had never allowed them to see. The Pacific Campaign would rage on for months more. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, all still ahead. But in the midst of that darkness, this single moment stood apart, not as a victory or defeat, but as proof that even in total war, compassion could still survive. The rations were eaten. The prisoners were silent. The Marines went back to their duties. The day passed and the jungle fell quiet again. But something had changed. Invisible, permanent. The men who lived through it carried that memory long after they left the islands behind. And soon after, the world would plunge again into unimaginable violence, where mercy was tested and humanity once more buried beneath fire and steel. Yet for a heartbeat, in that December of 1944, the Pacific War had shown a glimpse of what it had tried so hard to destroy. The question remains, what came after? When the fighting resumed, when the islands burned again, did that flicker of mercy matter? History would soon deliver its answer. In the blood and chaos of the war's next chapter, the sun rose heavy through a sky washed with ash. Smoke drifted from the remains of what had once been a jungle, now a wasteland of scorched palm trunks and twisted metal. The sound of insects was gone, replaced by the soft hiss of the ocean on coral. Inside a makeshift marine encampment, Christmas meant little more than a date scratched into a helmet. The men were exhausted, their nerves raw, their thoughts fixed on home. A few of them had tried to mark the day, tying a strand of parachute silk to a tent pole, humming half-forgotten carols under their breath. Nearby, within a ring of wire and sandbags, sat a handful of Japanese prisoners, barely 20 of them, all starving. Their uniforms hung loose over their bones, eyes sunken into skulls that no longer seemed alive. They were not defiant anymore, just silent, watching, waiting. A Marine guard, Private First Class Thomas Keegan, 1st Marine Division, leaned on his rifle, staring at the prisoners. He was 21, from Iowa, and had been fighting since Palaliu. His face was burned, his hands blistered from coral cuts. He'd lost 2 friends that month. The Marines had been issued Christmas rations the night before. Tins of turkey, powdered potatoes, fruitcake, and cigarettes. Nothing special, but better than the usual. Most men ate in silence. Some couldn't stomach food at all. Keegan noticed the prisoners watching them. Their faces were expressionless, but their eyes followed every bite. One prisoner, no older than Keegan himself, licked his cracked lips and looked away, ashamed. For a long time, no one moved. Then quietly, Keegan reached into his pack and took out an unopened can of turkey. He walked to the edge of the wire. The other Marines looked up, uncertain. Keegan crouched and rolled the can toward the prisoners. It clattered against the dirt, coming to rest near a young Japanese soldier in tattered boots. The prisoner froze. His hands trembled, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came. Another Marine, Corporal Jensen, stepped beside Keegan, holding out a pack of cigarettes. He tossed it gently across the wire, and then one by one others followed. No one gave an order. No one said a word. They simply began sharing. Tins of rations, crackers, even pieces of fruitcake that had somehow survived the journey across the Pacific. The Japanese prisoners didn't move at first. They thought it was a trick. For years they'd been told that surrender meant humiliation, that Americans would mock them, torture them, desecrate their bodies. But as the moments passed and no harm came, they began to crawl forward. One man reached for the tin, bowed deeply, and opened it. The smell of food, real food, filled the air. He began to cry. That broke whatever invisible wall still stood between them. Others joined, eating slowly, silently, with tears streaking their dirt-caked faces. A Marine sergeant muttered, "Well, Merry Christmas. Boys." Someone laughed softly, the kind of laugh that only comes after too much pain. Hours later, a chaplain passed through the camp. He stopped when he saw what was happening. Marines sitting near the fence smoking with Japanese prisoners on the other side. He didn't intervene. He simply watched, then removed his cap and whispered a prayer neither side could hear. Later, in his field log, he would write, "They shared their food with the enemy." No sermon could have said more. When the sun began to set, the Marines collected their gear and returned to duty. The prisoners, now fed and silent, bowed low as they were led back toward their makeshift huts. No one spoke, not because they couldn't, but because words would have ruined it. That night, the Marines gathered near a small radio playing faint static. Somewhere far away, a newscaster from San Francisco spoke of snow, church bells, and victory on the horizon. The men listened without expression. Their world was still the jungle, still heat, blood, and silence. But for one day, it had been something else. Keegan would later write in a letter home, "I don't know if it meant anything, Mom, but I think for a while, we remembered we were human." The next morning, routine returned. The prisoners were marched to work details. The Marines went back to clearing bunkers and patrolling ravines. But that brief ceasefire, unspoken, unsanctioned, lingered in every man's memory. What began as a quiet act of mercy spread through whispers across nearby units. The boys on the southern ridge fed their prisoners, one Marine told another. It became a small story among many, one that felt out of place in a war built on annihilation, and yet it was real. The diaries, the chaplain's log, the field letters, they all tell the same thing. On Christmas Day, 1944, U.S. Marines on an unnamed Pacific island did something almost unthinkable. They treated their enemy like a man, but kindness could not stop the war. Even as that small island found its fleeting peace, others burned. Mindoro, Luzon, Burma, each soaked in new blood. The great machine of war rolled on, blind to the brief miracle that had occurred in its shadow. Still, for those few who were there, the moment stayed alive long after the gunfire faded. One Marine called it the quietest victory we ever had. The real test came afterward, when orders arrived, and the war resumed with even greater fury. Could mercy survive once the killing began again? Could men who had tasted compassion return to the cold mechanics of war? That question would find its answer soon enough, in the next battles, where mercy was once again drowned in fire. The days following that Christmas morning unfolded like all others, but for those who had been there, nothing felt quite the same. The war resumed its rhythm. Patrols continued. The jungle swallowed the traces of humanity as quickly as it had revealed them. And yet, in the minds of the men who had shared food across the wire, a small part of them refused to return fully to the brutality they'd lived by. Private Keegan wrote another letter a few days later. "It's strange. We fought these people for so long I forgot they could be scared. Same as us. Feeding them didn't make me soft. It just made the world feel a little less mad. But war is not a place for such thoughts." Commanding officers seldom encouraged reflection. Compassion had no place in the doctrine of total victory. The Marines were trained to kill efficiently, not to empathize, and so, when a fresh order came down, to move out and clear the last pockets of resistance in the jungle hills. Those same men who had shared their Christmas rations cleaned their rifles and prepared to fight again. The Japanese holdouts had heard of what had happened too. Among the starving soldiers hiding in the caves, rumors spread that the Americans were not demons after all, that they had fed prisoners instead of killing them. Some refused to believe it. Others, desperate and broken, wanted to. On the 27th of December, a small group emerged from the trees carrying a white cloth. They were weak, unarmed. The Marines, wary of traps, aimed their rifles but held their fire. The group collapsed halfway down the slope, one man clutching his stomach too weak to stand. This time the surrender was accepted. The prisoners were treated, fed, and led to the same camp where, 2 days earlier, the Christmas rations had been shared. By then, word had reached Marine Field Command. The officers knew what had happened. The gifts of food, the unrecorded truce, but chose to let it pass. The gesture, while irregular, had caused no harm. And deep down, even the hardest men understood. These things mattered. They reminded soldiers that victory wasn't measured only in territory or body counts. Still, it could not last. By January 1945, the same Marines were redeployed to the Philippines to join the offensive on Luzon. There, the war's mercy vanished completely. The fighting in the jungles of Luzon was savage beyond comprehension. Close-quarters ambushes, flamethrowers clearing tunnels, civilians caught between both sides. For many Marines who had lived through that quiet Christmas, it felt as though the world had snapped back into madness. The men they had pitied they now faced again, not as prisoners but as fanatics who fought to the last. War had erased its own brief pause, but the memory endured. Even amid the horror of new battles, veterans carried the image of that morning. A can of turkey sliding across the dirt, the bow of a starving enemy, the shared silence of understanding. It became a private counterweight to everything else, a reminder that beneath the hate and blood, there was something left worth saving. For the Japanese prisoners, too, that moment lived on. In the years after the war, when Japan lay in ruins and survivors began to speak, a few recounted that strange Christmas. One man, a former corporal who had been among the captured, wrote in his memoir, "We had been told Americans were devils. That day they fed us. It broke something inside me, the part that believed dying was better than living with shame. I realized then that mercy was not weakness, and that I had been lied to." That reflection echoed what countless Japanese soldiers would later express after the surrender in August 1945. The propaganda that had fueled their fanaticism dissolved in the face of human acts they couldn't reconcile with their training. The Marines who survived the Pacific came home changed. Most never spoke about the Christmas truce, not out of secrecy but because it didn't fit into the story the world wanted to hear. People wanted tales of valor, heroism, victory, not a fleeting moment of mercy. But some did remember. In veterans' reunions decades later, men would speak of it quietly over beers and fading photographs. They described the look on the prisoners' faces, the way the air felt still, the way it reminded them of the homes they'd left behind. And in every telling, there was the same pause. The unspoken truth that, in that moment, both sides had found something purer than victory. The war, of course, would end in cataclysm, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the surrender of an empire. But for the men who shared their food on that remote island, the end of the war wasn't what brought peace. It had already come for a single morning, in a silence filled only with breathing and the clink of metal tins. The climax of that story wasn't the act itself, but what it revealed. That even in the most dehumanizing conflict in history, humanity refused to die completely. That was the true victory, not on a map, not in a report, but in the eyes of starving men who, for the first time in years, saw compassion where they expected cruelty. The event faded into obscurity, buried beneath the enormity of the war's closing months, but its legacy would echo in the years that followed, shaping how former enemies rebuilt, remembered, and reconciled. For the war was ending, but what came after would test that fragile peace in ways no battlefield ever could. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world awoke from a nightmare. Japan lay in ruins, its cities reduced to ash, its people starving, its empire dissolved. Across the Pacific, millions of men returned home carrying memories they could not easily bury. For the Marines who had served on the outer islands, the end brought no triumph, only relief. They were alive. That was enough. But for those few who had been part of that Christmas Day exchange, the relief carried a deeper weight, an understanding that the enemy they'd been taught to hate had been just as human, just as broken. When interviewed years later, one Marine from the 1st Division, he never gave his full name, said quietly, "That day showed me the war could have ended a different way, not with bombs, with bread." It was a poetic thought, perhaps too simple for the machinery of history. but it captured a truth that official records often miss, that moments of mercy in total war were as rare as they were powerful. After Japan's surrender, Allied occupation forces began the colossal task of rebuilding a nation. Among the first to return were American military personnel, some of whom had fought on the very islands that had once been enemy strongholds. The bitterness of war lingered. Yet there were also glimpses of grace. In Okinawa, Marines distributed food to starving civilians. In Tokyo, American medics treated Japanese children. Across a ruined empire, the same soldiers who had once fought against Japan now worked to keep its people alive. For many of those Marines, the Christmas Day act from the previous year had foreshadowed what would come. The shift from destroyers to rebuilders, from enemies to caretakers. The memory of that day, however small, had planted something, a seed of empathy that found root in the rubble of defeat. In post-war Japan, the stories of mercy shown by American soldiers began to circulate slowly. The Japanese press, once muzzled by military censorship, started printing accounts from returning soldiers and civilians who had encountered unexpected compassion. One of those stories, the Christmas ration sharing, appeared briefly in a local Nagasaki newspaper in 1947, retold by a former POW who had survived that island camp. His recollection was simple, almost understated. They shared food on the day their God was born. I thought then maybe we were not so different. That line, quiet, reflective, mirrored what many Japanese veterans would later come to feel. The realization that the enemy they had fought was not a faceless monster, but another nation of human beings trapped in the same storm. Meanwhile, in the United States, stories like these rarely reached the public. The focus was on victory, not empathy. The Pacific War had been too brutal to invite sentiment. Few Americans were ready to hear about compassion toward Japanese soldiers so soon after Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and the countless atrocities of the conflict. But among veterans, the memory survived in whispers. At reunions in the 1950s and 60s, men would tell the story to each other in low tones, often beginning with, "Did you hear about Christmas '44? They spoke of the hunger, the silence, the way the prisoners bowed before eating. And always there was the same sense of wonder, that in the darkest part of the war they had seen light. As the decades passed, the world's memory of the Pacific War began to soften. Documentaries, memoirs, and oral histories unearthed stories that had been buried beneath decades of anger. The Christmas ration sharing episode resurfaced again in the 1980s, cited in a University of Hawaii oral history project on Pacific veterans. It appeared in 3 separate testimonies, each matching the other in small details. The cans, the cigarettes, the silence. Historians could not pinpoint the exact island nor the precise unit, but the event's authenticity was clear in the consistency of the memories. And in those memories, the same sentiment echoed again and again. The moment had not ended the war, but it had changed the men who lived it. That change, that quiet awakening of empathy, became the hidden foundation of something larger, the peace that would follow. The same soldiers who had once fought without mercy would later advocate for reconciliation, for aid, for friendship with Japan. Their generation had seen both extremes, the worst of human cruelty, and the faintest glimmer of its opposite. And when they spoke of the latter, it was never with pride, but with reverence, because in a war where death was measured in millions, one act of kindness had somehow survived. In the years following the war, Japan and the United States would become unlikely allies, their relationship rebuilt from the ashes of the very conflict that had once defined them. Factories that had produced weapons now built cars. Airfields that had launched bombers now welcomed passenger flights. And the men who had once fought and bled on opposite sides began to meet again, not on battlefields but in ceremonies, classrooms, and quiet memorials. Among them were a few of the Marines and Japanese veterans who had lived through that Christmas morning. They came not as soldiers but as old men, carrying faded photographs, medals tarnished by salt and time, and memories they still could not fully explain. At one such gathering in the 1970s, a Marine named James Tom Keegan, perhaps the same Iowa boy who had shared his ration tin across the wire, met a former Japanese POW who had been present that same day. The meeting was brief, almost wordless. The Japanese veteran bowed deeply. Keegan extended his hand. Neither spoke of war or guilt or victory. They simply stood in silence, tears in both men's eyes. A reporter nearby wrote afterward, "There are some apologies that need no words. For Japan, the occupation years, 1945-1952, were a time of starvation and recovery. Food aid from the United States, including shipments of surplus military rations, became a lifeline. To many Japanese civilians, those crates stamped U.S. Army were the first proof that their former enemies were now their providers. Some historians have noted a curious continuity. The same rations once shared in a barbed wire camp in 1944 became the symbols of survival in post-war Japan. What had once been a gesture of mercy became national policy, extended to millions. In that sense, the Christmas ration-sharing moment was more than symbolic. It was prophetic, an early glimpse of what would follow: compassion replacing conquest, sustenance replacing annihilation. The men who lived through that day rarely sought recognition. Their memories were too personal, too fragile to parade. When oral historians asked them why they had done it, why they had shared food with an enemy who had killed so many, the answers were always simple: because it was Christmas, because they were starving, because it felt right. No grand speeches, no moral declarations, just quiet decency, born of exhaustion and humanity. For many of those men, it was the one thing about the war they felt unashamed to remember. They could talk about that day without trembling, without nightmares. It was the only memory that brought peace instead of guilt. Over time, historians began to see these small gestures, isolated acts of compassion amid destruction, as threads that helped mend the moral fabric torn apart by total war. They were reminders that even in humanity's darkest century, mercy never disappeared completely. By the turn of the millennium, as the last veterans of the Pacific passed away, the story of the 1944 Christmas rations began appearing in books, documentaries, and online archives, fragments pieced together from letters, chaplains' logs, and Japanese memoirs. Its significance was never measured by military outcomes, but by what it revealed about human endurance. In the chaos of the Pacific, a theater defined by brutality, the story stood apart as one of the few that spoke of grace. One Japanese historian wrote in 2002, "War did not end when the guns fell silent. It ended when one soldier fed another." That sentiment captured the heart of what the Marines had unknowingly done that Christmas. They had ended something within themselves before the world was ready to stop fighting. The war had taken their youth, their friends, their innocence, but on that small island it gave them something back: the simple realization that even in hell, men could still choose kindness. When those veterans died, their stories lived on through their families. Letters kept in drawers, photographs folded into Bibles, tin ration cans displayed in glass cases. And for every Marine or Japanese soldier who shared that silent moment of mercy, history finally remembered what they had known all along: that even the smallest act of humanity can echo louder than the roar of war. But history is not only about what men did, it is about what those moments meant. And to understand that meaning, to see what this single act revealed about war, peace, and the fragile balance between, we must look beyond the battlefield entirely, to the reflection. War is remembered through numbers, through tonnage, casualties, victories, and dates. But the truth of war rarely lives in numbers. It lives in moments, the quiet ones that never make it into textbooks. The story of the Marines who shared their rations with Japanese prisoners on Christmas Day 1944 is one of those moments. It did not alter the course of history. It did not end the war or save lives on a grand scale. Yet in its smallness lies its power, a brief defiance of everything war demanded men to become. For years, the Pacific conflict was defined by hatred so deep it seemed eternal. Each side saw the other as inhuman, unworthy of mercy. The islands became slaughterhouses, the seas graveyards. And yet amid that total dehumanization, one act reminded both sides of something they had forgotten: that even in war, compassion was possible. What those Marines did that morning was not strategic. It was not religious, though it happened on Christmas. It was instinct. The flicker of empathy in men exhausted by hate. And in that flicker, the Pacific War, one of the most merciless campaigns in human history, revealed that humanity could still survive beneath its ashes. For the Japanese prisoners, that food meant more than nourishment. It was the collapse of a lie, the realization that the enemy was capable of mercy. For the Marines, it was a brief reprieve from the killing, a return to decency that no uniform or order could erase. History often remembers the grand gestures, the treaties, the surrenders, the speeches, but the soul of history is written in moments like this: quiet, fleeting, human. When a Marine passed a ration tin through barbed wire, he did something greater than feed a man. He reminded the world that even when nations lose their conscience, individuals can still choose to act with it. And that is the legacy of that forgotten Christmas in 1944. Not a tale of war, but of what survived within it. Not about enemies, but about men. A whisper against the noise of destruction, proving that even at the end of all things, the human heart remembers how to be kind.